The lease on the dollar. Why the rules of money are being renegotiated right now. Consumer credit card debt crossed $1.2 trillion in 2025. Small business bankruptcies are up more than 30% year over year. The 10-year Treasury yield in early 2026 is sitting higher than it was at the peak of the worst inflation crisis America has seen in 4 decades. These are not warning signs. These are active symptoms of a system already under structural strain. What makes this moment different from every previous recession discussion is the nature of what is actually happening underneath the surface numbers. This is not a standard cyclical downturn. This is the early measurable phase of a monetary system transition, a change in the foundational rules of how money works globally. And most retirement portfolios were designed for the old rules. The commercial lease to understand what is happening. One metaphor does more explanatory work than any chart. Think of the global financial system as a massive commercial lease. After the Second World War, the world signed an agreement with the United States. The terms were relatively straightforward. The US dollar would serve as the global reserve currency, meaning every country would hold dollars in reserve and settle international trade, especially oil in dollars. In exchange, the United States would maintain a stable currency, manageable inflation, and the military capacity to keep global trade routes secure. That lease has been running for 80 years. For most of that period, it genuinely worked. Countries received access to a stable, universally accepted medium of exchange. The United States received an extraordinary privilege, the ability to run deficits that would destabilize any other nation on earth while still finding willing buyers for its debt. But here's the problem with long leases. The landlord eventually starts taking liberties, and the tenants eventually start looking at what else is available. The first significant liberty arrived in 1971 when the connection between the dollar and gold was severed. Before that point, foreign governments could theoretically exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. After that point, the dollar became backed by nothing except trust, the full faith and credit of the US government. Trust is a psychological asset. Psychological assets do not decay linearly. They hold, and then they do not. The evidence suggests we are entering the period of they do not. The structure of the debt problem. The US national debt now stands at approximately $36 trillion, roughly 120% of GDP. If an individual earned $60,000 per year but carried $72,000 in credit card debt, their debt-to-income ratio would be identical to the current US federal position. The standard response to this comparison is that the US recovered from similarly high debt levels after the Second World War. That is true. But the reversal worth understanding is this: the debt level itself is not the primary problem. The structure of the debt is. After the Second World War, the United States was demographically young, operated a dominant domestic manufacturing base, who was a net creditor nation, and had decades of productivity growth ahead to grow out of its obligations. The current situation differs on every dimension: an aging population, offshore manufacturing, net debtor status, and the figure nobody says plainly, annual interest. Payments on the national debt exceeded $1 trillion in 2025, for the first time in history, more than the entire defense budget. The United States is now spending more servicing its past obligations than protecting its borders. This is not a debt problem in the ordinary sense. This is the mathematical signature of a system that depends on continuously finding new buyers to pay the interest owed to previous buyers. For 15 years, the Federal Reserve served as the buyer of last resort, purchasing government bonds whenever the market showed insufficient demand. This practice, called quantitative easing in formal language, is more accurately described as creating money to buy government debt. It works until it produces inflation, and even after 2 full years of aggressive rate increases, inflation remains above the Federal Reserve's stated target. 5 forces firing simultaneously. Students of long economic cycles have identified a consistent pattern in how reserve currencies rise and fall. Every major reserve currency in recorded history, from the Spanish real to the Dutch guilder to the British pound, has followed a recognizable arc: rise, dominance, overextension, decline. And at each stage there are specific measurable signals. 5 major forces typically drive these transitions: internal political and economic stability, external geopolitical order, the debt cycle, technological change, and natural resource dynamics. Normally these forces operate on different rhythms, partially offsetting each other. Current evidence suggests all 5 are under simultaneous stress, a condition that has not occurred in approximately 80 years. Consider internal disorder first. The wealth gap between the top 1% and the bottom 50% of American households is currently wider than it was in 1929, the year before the Great Depression. This matters not in an abstract political sense, but in a direct financial mechanic. Extreme wealth inequality produces political instability, and political instability makes institutional investors nervous about holding long-term government debt. When uncertainty about a government's future obligations increases, large investors move toward assets that cannot be inflated away or defaulted on: physical commodities, hard assets, real property. This dynamic shows up in the data. Central banks globally purchase over 1,000 tons of gold in 2024, the second highest year on record. The buyers include China, India, and multiple emerging market nations. They are not purchasing gold because they find it aesthetically appealing. They are systematically and quietly reducing their exposure to dollar-denominated assets. This is the institutional equivalent of a tenant quietly touring alternative properties while still paying rent, so as not to alarm the landlord prematurely. The weaponization problem. The external dimension of this transition accelerated significantly in 2022 when the United States blocked Russia from the international banking settlement system as a response to its military actions. This was an unprecedented deployment of financial infrastructure as a geopolitical weapon. It worked in the short term. It also permanently changed the strategic calculation of every other country that has ever had a disputed relationship with the United States. A useful parallel. Imagine a small island nation that conducts all its trade through a single shipping company operating the only dock. The island pays whatever rates the company sets and follows whatever rules the company establishes because it has no alternative. Then one year, the company seizes a shipment over a political dispute. The following year, a competing company builds a second dock on the other side of the island. The moment a genuine alternative exists, the original company's leverage vanishes entirely. The international banking blockade was the seized shipment. The second dock is being constructed in real time. Russia and China began settling energy trades in their own currencies. China and Brazil signed bilateral currency agreements that bypassed dollar conversion. India began purchasing energy supplies in rupees. Gulf states, the same nations whose petrodollar arrangements in the 1970s were the foundation of dollar reserve dominance, are openly discussing pricing oil in a basket of currencies. None of this requires believing in conspiracy. It requires understanding incentives. If a payment system can be used to lock you out because a foreign government disagrees with your policies, you build an alternative payment system. And once that alternative exists, every country that has ever worried about being next begins using it. Not out of hostility to the United States, specifically. Out of rational This is the psychology of a bank run. The bank does not fail because it is insolvent. It fails because enough depositors believe it might become insolvent, withdraw simultaneously, and thereby make it insolvent. The process is self-fulfilling once it reaches a tipping point. What this means for a standard retirement portfolio. Consider someone 42 years old with $350,000 in a target date retirement fund set for approximately 25 years out. He contributes consistently, has never panicked during market downturns, and runs projections on major online calculators regularly. They consistently tell him he will retire with approximately $1.8 million. On paper, he is doing well. Here is what those calculators assume. 7% average annual real returns, 2.5% average annual inflation, and the assumption nobody states explicitly that the dollar in his account today will purchase roughly the same basket of goods as the dollar he retires within 2.5 decades. Adjust to any single one of those three assumptions, and the entire retirement projection changes substantially. If inflation averages 5% annually instead of 2.5% over the next 23 years, a scenario consistent with historical outcomes for heavily indebted governments facing fiscal pressure, his $1.8 million at retirement purchases, only what approximately $800,000 purchases today. His brokerage statement will still read $1.8 million. The purchasing power will have been cut in half. This is not a black swan scenario. Every major government that has faced a structural debt crisis, from post-war Britain to multiple Latin American economies across the last century, has eventually chosen to inflate away a portion of its obligations. It is politically easier than raising taxes or cutting spending, and it transfers wealth from savers to debtors invisibly, without requiring any explicit policy announcement. There is a second mechanism worth understanding. If dollar reserve status erodes meaningfully, even partially, not catastrophically, the United States must offer higher interest rates to attract buyers for its government debt. Higher rates mean lower bond prices. They also mean lower stock valuations, because every equity price is ultimately a calculation of future earnings discounted at an interest rate. Raise the discount rate, reduce the present value of those future earnings. This is arithmetic, not opinion. A target date fund automatically shifts its allocation to what longer duration bonds as the holder approaches retirement. That is the design. It is described as reduced risk. In a rising interest rate environment, long duration bonds lose market value. A 30-year Treasury bond loses approximately 20% of its market value for every 2 percentage point increase in interest rates. The people most exposed to this risk are precisely those who trusted the standard advice and did exactly what they were told. The most likely outcome, the most probable trajectory is not dollar collapse. It is gradual erosion, a multipolar monetary system in which the dollar remains one of several significant reserve currencies, but no longer the sole dominant one. Historical precedent supports this reading. The transition from British pound dominance to dollar dominance after the Second World War was not a single crisis. It unfolded across decades of gradual structural shift. Reserve currency transitions happen slowly, and then suddenly, the slowly part takes a generation. In a gradual erosion scenario, the dollar does not collapse. It weakens incrementally, 3 to 5% in 1 year, 2% the next. Over a decade, the cumulative effect on purchasing power is substantial, but you do not feel it year to year. You feel it when you try to price your retirement in terms of what it actually buys, and by that point, the compounding adjustments that would have protected you have not been made. Here is a number that captures this dynamic, measured not in nominal dollars, but in ounces of gold. The broad U.S. stock market is roughly flat across a 25-year period ending in 2025, not up 500% as the dollar-denominated chart suggests, essentially flat, because gold has appreciated at approximately the same rate as equities over that period. What the market returned in nominal terms, monetary expansion has largely eroded in real terms. Savers who trusted the nominal number were treading water. Their statements said they were winning. Calibrated responses 3 specific actions. None of this suggests panic or wholesale portfolio liquidation. Panic is historically the worst possible response to a slow-moving structural shift. Reactive, emotional decisions, selling at the bottom, buying hard assets at the top, collectively destroy portfolios that disciplined inaction would have preserved. The appropriate response is calibrated adjustment, informed by an honest understanding of the forces at work. First, stress test your retirement projections against 5% average annual inflation rather than the 2.5% default most calculators use. Run the same projection with a higher inflation assumption and examine what it does to your purchasing power at retirement. If the result is catastrophic, you need that information now, not at age 63. If the result is manageable, your plan is more resilient than you believed, which is itself useful information. Second, examine the duration of your bond holdings. If you hold a target date fund, look up its average bond maturity in the fund prospectus or fact sheet. If the average maturity exceeds 10 years, you carry significant duration risk in an environment where interest rates may remain elevated or rise further. Moving toward shorter duration instruments, Treasury bills currently yield between 4 and 5%, with minimal duration risk is not a pessimistic bet. It is the removal of an unnecessary risk that is not being compensated. Third, introduce some measured exposure to assets that do not move in lockstep with the dollar. This does not mean abandoning index funds or abandoning diversification. It means acknowledging that holding 100% of your net worth in dollar-denominated assets is itself a concentrated position. Deconcentrating that position is standard portfolio construction, not paranoia. Options include international equities in developed markets, a modest allocation to gold, which appreciated approximately 29% in 2024 alone, income-producing real assets, or skills and business ownership that generate value independent of any particular monetary system. The people who navigated every monetary transition in recorded history most successfully were not those who held the most gold or the most cash. They were the ones who owned things that produced genuine value, regardless of which currency happened to be dominant at any given moment. That principle predates the Federal Reserve. It will outlast whatever comes next. Understanding the bet you are making the most important shift is not about portfolio construction. it is about consciousness. A standard target date fund holds the majority of its assets in U.S. equities and U.S. bonds, with the bond allocation automatically increasing as the holder approaches retirement. This is not inherently wrong, but it constitutes a concentrated bet that dollar stability persists and U.S. borrowing costs remain manageable for the next 20 to 30 years. That is a specific macro view embedded in what appears to be a neutral, diversified product. Making that bet consciously is reasonable. Making it without awareness that you are making any bet at all is a different matter. The financial industry has a structural incentive to keep this distinction invisible. Target date funds generate fee revenue on every dollar, regardless of the macro environment. The product was designed for a particular set of conditions. Explaining the conditions under which it might underperform is not in the product's commercial interest. Understanding the bet you are making is not pessimism. It is the minimum requirement for making the bet deliberately. The lease on the dollar is up for renegotiation, not necessarily for termination for renegotiation. The terms the world accepted for 80 years because no viable alternative existed are now being questioned by economic actors with enough scale to credibly consider alternatives. Whether the world eventually signs a new lease on dollar terms, builds a parallel system, or muddles through a messy multipolar arrangement is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the negotiation is actively happening right now. Being aware of that is the foundational requirement for making intelligent financial decisions over the next 20 years. The people who get hurt worst in slow-moving structural transitions are not those who ignored the data entirely. They are those who saw the signals, made a mental note to address it later, and then did not. That is not optimism. At compounding rates, it is the most reliable mechanism for destroying wealth that exists.